Good afternoon. It's 20 after 2 already. I had to lay back down today for a little while because I'm exhausted. I wanted to give you just a quick rundown on the relatives on both sides of the family. On Dad's side of the family, there was Lyle, and Lyle married Helen, and they lived in Sultan that had a very large strawberry farm, and then later in life they turned it into raspberries. I don't know how many acres, but every summer we would visit with all of Dad's relatives. We'd travel from Colville over to the coast, and this is kind of a cute little thing. When I was only, we lived in Colville and across from Sherry Nixon, my little girlfriend. So I was 6 years old. I was in the first grade, and that year my dad had given me a quarter. Now, back then a quarter was a lot of money. It was compared to maybe like a $5 bill would be to a kid nowadays. So I had that quarter. We got in the old green Plymouth. It was shaped kind of like a coupe, really small car, and really kind of a homely thing, but the family got in the coupe, Plymouth. We were driving over Stevens Pass, which was always just this 2-lane highway with no, turnouts. It was really dangerous. And my dad was a horrible, horrible driver. Now, I don't care what any of the family says. They weren't with him on these long-distance trips. Denny and I were. He was speedy, he was fast, and he was careless. And I mean, he would pass cars going over that pass until my mother would just about die from heart failure. And she'd be sitting there begging him, "Louie, slow down, don't pass here, it's too close to the other, And, "Oh, I'm fine. And he would just, as God is my witness, barely make it by the skin of his teeth. Very careless. But we made it, we lived through it, all those trips that we took, but it was very nerve-wracking. But anyway, on this one particular trip, I had a quarter. We're going over Stevens Pass. I said to my mom, "Hey, can I have a hanky?" And she always carried handkerchiefs, not Kleenex. And okay, so she gives me her lightweight hanky, and for some reason I wrapped the quarter up in the hanky. And then for some reason, because, people do stupid things, kids do stupider things, I wrapped the quarter in the hanky, and I rolled the window down, and I was having fun watching the hanky fly in the, we were going maybe 40 miles an hour, maybe more, I'm not sure. And all of a sudden, a wind gust, of course, took the hanky away with the quarter. And there went my precious money. And I cried and cried and cried and cried. And Dad said, "Well, just be still. You're the one that did it." And my mom, of course, was sympathetic, and I lived through the episode, but that memory stuck in my mind. And then there was another time in Mill Creek. Again, my dad had given me a quarter. And he's down at the creek area with this huge bonfire going. He's clearing brush, working really hard, because Dad was a very, very hard worker, as you know. And I'm standing by the fire, and for some reason I throw my quarter in the bonfire. Now, you tell me what possesses a kid to throw money away. Literally. You've heard the saying, "Oh, they just throw money away." Well, 2 episodes in my young life, age 5 and 6, I literally threw money away. Okay, let's get back to the family. So, coming over the trips, we would stay with Lyle and Helen, and they had this big strawberry farm, many, many, many acres. They had to hire laborers that would come in, pick the berries, and then they'd sell the berries. Later on, they took the strawberries out and put in raspberries, and that was their livelihood. I don't think Lyle worked out other than the berry farm. I don't think so. Alan worked in the reformatory for all of his years until he retired. Roseanne was a stay-at-home person. She never worked out, ever. Back in that day, though, in the 50s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, women pretty much stayed home and raised the kids. And that's the way, actually, that's the way the Bible says to do it. It's sad that, in fact, the Bible says in 1 Timothy, I believe, 1st or 2nd Timothy, where the Apostle Paul says that women or wives are to be keepers at home, obedient to their husbands, caring for the children. So nowadays it's just not that way. I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying that times have changed. Okay, so that was that side of the family. Then on my mom's side of the family, none of the women worked out. It was my mom, Annie, Margaret, Mary. They were all stay-at-home mothers. They all had children to raise. The men were like this. Mike, I'll do as I can remember. My Uncle Mike worked at Barman's department store. And when Mom and Dad and I and Denny lived in the brand new house that my dad had built in Colville, I was, I think, 10 years old. And one night, Barman's huge, in Colville, a building had to be pretty big to be called big. Well, Barman's was big. It was a 3-story department store. It had furniture, it had household things, but mostly furniture. And it burnt to the ground. And our house was located, our new home was located up on the hill, up by the hospital. And that was like a 3-alarm or more fire. And so Denny and I, we of course bounded out of bed and we were watching out the living room window, and that was just a horrible thing that happened. So Mike lost his job for a good long time until they rebuilt. So Mike, Leo, even though Leo suffered terrible post-traumatic stress from being in the Second World War, he served in New Guinea fighting against the Japanese. And New Guinea was a very isolated island. It back then had cannibals. So not only did the soldiers have to worry about the Japanese soldiers, they had to worry about the cannibals. So he came home with a severe case of PST. But even in spite of that, he managed to go on to college and become a school teacher. But he was never quite right. He had married a Australian lady. So like my Uncle Francis, he married a war bride, and Ruth and Francis lived in Colville all the days of their life. I guess he was pretty successful as a teacher though, but unfortunately when he got old, I think in his late 60s, early 70s, he ended up in Western State Mental Hospital. I think his brain just deteriorated, and he died a very painful death in the Colville Hospital a few years later. So that was Uncle Leo. He and Ruth had a good marriage, though. My Uncle Francis, what did Francis do? Oh, he worked for the post office. Yeah, he was I'm not sure what he did, but I know in Spokane, he and Teddy lived in Spokane, and he worked for the post office, and he liked his job. And then Joe was a butcher. He worked for the co-op in Colville. Kitty, quit it. Bella. Now it's a towel hanging over her chair. She thinks it's a toy, of course. Anyway, so he was a butcher, and my mom always complained that he would put his thumb on the scale, so if you ordered a pound of hamburger, she'd generally have to pay a few pennies more. She thought, anyway, because she claimed that Uncle Joe would somehow put his thumb on the scale and the meat would weigh a few more ounces than it did. Whether he did or not, I don't know, but Joe was a bit of a conniver. He was, well, Denny can tell you, he wasn't always honest. He was fun to be around. He was loud, he was a storyteller, he could cuss up a storm, he could tell jokes. He was really fun to be with. There was one point in time when we lived at White Mud Lake. He lived with us for a couple years. I think he had just divorced. He was only married once, and Ophel, isn't that a terrible name, Ophel, she left him. They had 2 boys. They were teens at the time, and she got sick of his whatever. And I don't think it was maybe faithful. I'm not sure, but knowing his personality. Anyway, she left him. And that was back in the day when divorce was very rare, very, very rare, hardly ever happened. So Joe lived with us for a couple of years, and I enjoyed his company. I mean, he was fun. Mike and Leo Francis were all very quiet. They were the quiet ones. Joe made up for it. Then there was Uncle Carl, and Uncle Carl was kind of a pain in the neck. He was the oldest, of course. And I remember when we lived in Colville and I was a teenager, for those couple, 3 years there in the pink house on the hill going out of town, every wash day he would stop by. Not every, no, but almost every wash day, Uncle Carl would stop in to visit Dee Dee. And my mom didn't have the courage to tell him, please don't stop on wash day, you know, stop on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but not Monday and Tuesday, because that's Washing and Ironing Day. But instead, Mom put up with it, and then she'd have to listen to his stories and listen to him talk and talk. And he was a gabber. He wasn't funny. He didn't tell jokes. He wasn't like Joe, but he liked to talk. So he would just take up Mom's time, just talking about yak, whatever. And poor Mom would be trying to get the clothes out on the line, and I'd usually take over and hang them out, because I loved wash day. That was my favorite day. So I always helped Mom hang clothes out. And if Carl was bugging Mom, I would just take the wash pan, hard to remember some of these simple words, out and hang them on the line myself, because, you know, and then the breeze would come up in Colville, that nice warm spring and summer, fall even breeze, and it was so fresh. We didn't have chemtrails back then. We didn't have pollution back then. It was just pure God-sent, fresh mountain air. Nothing more beautiful than Colville. Okay, so Carl's job was a farmer. He still had a family farm. He sold a few animals and produce, and somehow they made it on the farm. And they were a staunch Catholic couple. So he and Della was the wife. Della, boy, what weird names. They raised, I think, 6 kids as farmers. So that was quite a feat. Am I leaving anybody out? Of course, Dad worked in the parts department for a couple different automotive outfits. And it wasn't just automotive. They sold a lot of parts for tractors and farm equipment, because back then, of course, as I said, a lot of farmers were still working. Okay, well, if I left anybody out, I'm sorry. I should have written this down. And I didn't, but I haven't made a video yet today, so this was just a quick one. I'm going to turn it off now. I'll be back later. Bye-bye.